Hey everybody, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and for our second class of drug that we are talking about this week, we are moving on to talking about the psychomotor stimulants. So psychomotor stimulants include drugs such as cocaine, amphetamines, and a variety of different compounds. Now, we're going to call these psychomotor stimulants because these drugs enhance sensory motor activation. You're going to see increased alertness, heightened arousal, and you're going to get a lot of behavioral excitement. So one of the things you'll kind of notice here on this slide is that I am only talking about cocaine for this set of slides. I will follow that up with another recording from the same lecture, specifically talking about amphetamines. So let's talk a little bit and give an overview of what we're going to talk about with respect to cocaine. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background and history. We're going to talk about the pharmacology of cocaine and mechanisms of cocaine action. And then we're going to finish up by talking about some of the acute behavioral and physiological effects that are caused by cocaine. So let's start by talking about the background and the history of cocaine use. So cocaine and amphetamines, as I mentioned, are called psychomotor stimulants. As I already mentioned, these cause sensory motor activation. As I said, you're going to see increased alertness, heightened arousal and attention, and an increase in behavioral excitement. So where does cocaine come from? So cocaine is an alkaloid that is basically found in the leaves of the Erythroxylon coca shrub. This shrub is native to South America, so you're largely going to find it in areas like the northern and the central Andes Mountains, basically extending from Colombia all the way down into Bolivia. So generally, people that live in these regions chew coca leaves. And so this is a practice that has been thought to begun at least 2,000 years ago and as many as 5,000 years ago. Now, cocaine is a weak base. So oftentimes what you will find is that coca chewers may include lime or ash to make the pH of the saliva a little bit more alkaline. And it turns out that the reason that you would want to maybe chew lime or ash with it is that it decreases the ionization. Remember that the less a drug ionizes, the more easily it can passively diffuse across membranes. So we get greater absorption when the drug is less ionized. So by cutting it with something like lime, which is an acid, it's got citric acid, you're basically promoting absorption across the mucous membranes of the oral cavity. So you'll get greater absorption. So coca leaves, coca chewing, as you can kind of see here, coca chewing was actually an Incan practice, often for religious ceremonies or other types of important ceremonies. And it was basically generally restricted up to the ruling classes until the Spanish conquest and the conquistadors basically came in and the Incan Empire ultimately fell. So after the Incan Empire fell, coca chewing became a lot more widespread, and there are even some archaeological evidence that coca was used as a medium of exchange. It basically became a currency. But missionaries and clergy were kind of arguing that coca chewing was idolatrous, and it was basically preventing people who lived in this area from being converted to Catholicism. And so ultimately, it was discouraged and even outlawed or banned by the Catholic Church. But what they ended up finding is that without the stimulation that coca provided, and remember, stimulants like these are also going to be appetite suppressants, The workers had significantly less stamina and endurance. They weren't able to work long hours in mines and fields at high altitudes. So the coca ban was eventually reversed. So coca leaves were brought back to Europe, but it never really caught on there. And that's partially because you're basically taking these leaves, like the alkaloid in the coca shrub bush, you're taking a plant, you're going overseas from South America to Europe, which is a long trip. Like, generally, the products in those plants generally won't survive. But people who traveled to South America sampled the leaf, and generally they reported some positive effects. And basically, by the late 1850s, German researchers had isolated pure cocaine in the 1850s, and they were able to characterize it chemically. And as a result, for the next 3 decades, cocaine became a lot more popular. In particular, a chemist by the name of Angelo Mariani basically concocted a mixture of wine and cocaine, which was called Vin Mariani. And of course, we can't talk about something in psychology without talking about Sigmund Freud. Basically, Sigmund Freud was a very notable user. In 1885, he published a manuscript called Über Coca, or On Coca, which basically talked about the positives of the drug and basically recommended it as a potential treatment for alcoholism, opioid abuse, depression, digestive problems. And he actually performed the first recorded psychopharmacological experiments on cocaine despite not really having the background. And he actually published these results in a paper called Contributions to the Knowledge of the Effect of Cocaine. He did acknowledge the dangers of cocaine in treating morphine addiction, but what's interesting is how much he maintained that the drug was non-addictive under a variety of other circumstances. So cocaine popularity is generally starting to grow, particularly moving from Europe into the United States, particularly in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. There were 15 different forms of cocaine and coca, including cigarettes, inhalants, and then we have the development of Coca-Cola. So this contained cocaine from the coca leaf, and it contained caffeine from the cola nut. And basically, Coca-Cola and other types of tonics were marketed as an alternative to alcohol. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is how many of the sodas that people enjoy originally started containing different types of drugs, because these were tonics that were supposed to promote health. So for example, 7-Up used to contain lithium. Now, one thing that I will mention, cocaine was removed from Coca-Cola in 1903, but Coca-Cola does contain a non-narcotic extract from the coca leaf that is regularly prepared by a chemical company in the US. So even though it does not contain cocaine, it contains some aspects of the coca leaf that are non-narcotic in nature. Now, if you go to the World of Coca-Cola in Atlanta, Georgia, they will not mention any of this to you. But do be aware, Coca-Cola definitely used to contain cocaine for a very short period of time. Additionally, cocaine was, as you can see, an advertisement for cocaine tooth drops, and these were given to infants for discomfort related to teething. And we'll talk a little bit more about the local anesthetic effects of cocaine and other similar chemically similar drugs such as lidocaine, benzocaine, and penocaine. So you can see, again, going back to what we talked about addiction, what often tends to happen is that a drug catches on until it becomes a problem, or it becomes too prevalent, or there's the perception that there's a problem. And ultimately, as a result, the government starts to intervene. So cocaine abuse began to be very widespread by the 1900s, and President Taft basically declared cocaine to be public enemy number one by 1910. And then, as we kind of talked about in our history of drug policy, the Harrison Act in 1914 prohibited the inclusion of cocaine and, as we kind of talked about, opioids in over-the-counter medications, and basically there were additional restrictions on its import and sale. Now, basically from the 20s up until about the 1960s, not a lot of people used cocaine, but there were a small group of like avant-garde users, like artists and musicians and performers. But 1970 or so is around the time that it started to kind of blow up again. So basically, in the 1970s, the first major wave that hits is an escalation of use either by snorting or insufflation of cocaine in its powdered form or intravenous injection. And so you can kind of see it's basically becoming a disco or a club drug known as blow. People are snorting it. People are injecting it. By the 1980s, this is when crack becomes a problem, or its rock form. And part of the reason that this became a problem was it was considerably cheaper than cocaine in its powdered form, and because it was being smoked rather than snorted, as a result, it became much more potent and it acted on the brain much more quickly. So now let's move on to talking about the basic pharmacology of cocaine. So here you can kind of see the chemical structure of cocaine. And cocaine is basically made up of two different types of rings. It is made up of a 6-carbon phenyl ring, and it's also made up of a nitrogen ring. So the 6-carbon phenyl ring is on the right, as I've kind of indicated. The nitrogen ring is on the left, and both of these are going to be necessary for the drug's activity. Now, you are looking here at two different drugs that are related to cocaine. This is when cocaine has been manipulated for a variety of different purposes. These are often only going to be used for research purposes. These are two different synthetics. So this is WEN 35428, also known as CFT. And then here we have RTI 55, known as beta CIT. Both of these are going to lack that ester ring, which is right here, that OCO right here. Both of them lack that ester ring, and as a result, they're going to be a bit more potent. Additionally, both of them have a halogen on the phenyl ring. So here we have fluorine, here we have iodine. As a result, these are going to be more potent than cocaine, but these are often going to be used for experimental purposes only. So how do we make this alkaloid become a much more potent drug? So coca leaves don't really have that much cocaine. They really only have about 0.6% and 1.8% cocaine, give or take. So really chewing the leaves will give you a quick pick-me-up, but it's going to feel more like a cup of coffee or black tea than it will like cocaine in its powdered form. But if we extract the leaves and we basically extract them and concentrate them into a paste, at that point, that is about 80% cocaine. And then what you do once you have that paste, so already it's becoming more potent by converting it and concentrating it into its paste form, but we can make that even more potent by converting it to a hydrochloride salt and crystallizing it. And basically this becomes cocaine hydrochloride. This is very water soluble. This is the solution that was put into Vin Mariani. It can be taken intranasally by snorting, or it can be dissolved in water, and it can be injected. Now, one of the major disadvantages of its hydrochloride salt form is that it's not heat stable. As a result, it can't be smoked. However, if we want to smoke it, and folks, this is my reminder, this is not anything that you ever want to get involved in, but for those who want to make it more more concentrated and make it smokable, you're basically going to transform it into a freebase. So around the time that I came into Coty, there was a song that was called I'm in Love with the Cocoa. And it was not, in fact, about loving chocolate, but rather it was about cocaine. And for somebody who had not yet taught drugs and behavior, the lyrics baking soda, I got baking soda, didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But if you understand the chemistry of how you transform that hydrochloride salt into a freebase, at that point, you will understand why baking soda is involved. So basically what you're gonna do is you're gonna freebase it. This is basically what you're gonna do is you're gonna dissolve the cocaine in water. So the hydrochloride salt gets dissolved in water. You add an alkaline solution. Usually that was going to be ammonia, and then you would extract the resulting base with some type of organic solvent like ether. So that's what freebasing was. But the problem is that at the time, ether, and it still is, it's not just at the time, ether is highly flammable and it's explosive. So basically creating a freebase in this manner was incredibly dangerous. This method, ether residue may still be present on the freebase. As a result, this is a very dangerous method. Similar to things like making meth at home. You are dealing with chemicals that are highly flammable and can explode. By the early 1980s, you could actually make that base safer by dissolving the hydrochloride with baking soda, and then you heat the mixture and dry it. So basically what ended up happening is you would have these chunks of this dry, hardened mixture, and they called it crack. And the reason that they called it crack is because of the popping sounds that are produced when those chunks of cocaine hydrochloride are mixed with that baking soda. It's also called rock. These are generally a lot less expensive than cocaine is. And so the cocaine that actually ends up in the bloodstream is the same substance regardless of whether it was the hydrochloride salt or it was the freebase. However, the heat that is involved in smoking crack produces different chemical products that can be detected in the urine, and that way people can actually figure out if it was crack that was being smoked or simply snorting cocaine. So here's an example of what that crack cocaine or that rock cocaine looks like. So let's talk a little bit about the absorption of cocaine and the distribution. So you are going to get really rapid absorption both with IV injection, which you can see right here. So that hydrochloride salt getting dissolved into water and injected, or if you smoke it, you can see that there's a very rapid absorption. So single doses that are taken by these roots, as you can see, are going to have really high concentration of circulating cocaine. And you'll get even higher doses, you'll get even higher concentrations with the multiple doses that might be part of a cocaine binge. You can see, though, that the routes like intranasal, like snorting, or the oral method typically will yield lower cocaine levels. Something kind of interesting that's not included here, just a few hours of coca leaf chewing delivers enough drug to basically mimic the plasma concentration that's produced by a modest dose taken orally or intranasally. So you would have to basically chew coca leaves for hours to basically get these plasma concentration levels. So you are going to have slower absorption and distribution with snorting and with oral methods. Now, cocaine crosses the blood-brain barrier very easily, and it's because it is incredibly fat soluble. This is especially important when you are smoking cocaine because ultimately you're going to get an exposure in the brain to a very large surge of the drug that you're not necessarily going to see in areas like the peripheral vein. So typically what researchers would do if they wanted to figure out how much concentration of a drug you had in your blood, they would check an area like one of your peripheral system veins, like a vein in your arm, because typically it's going to match the levels that are in the brain. That is not the case with smoking. It actually leads to a surge of drug reaching the brain, and it's not actually matching the concentration in the peripheral veins. As a result, this may potentially explain the strong addictive potential of cocaine, particularly when it is smoked. Now, the metabolism of cocaine is very fast. So it's going to be broken down by enzymes, both in the bloodstream and in the liver, and it's going to be very rapidly eliminated as well. It basically has a half-life that ranges between 30 minutes to 1.5 hours. So basically, you would be pretty close to clearing any cocaine in your system, those 3 half-lives, within an hour and a half to 4.5 hours. So generally, the subjective high that's produced by IV or a smoked dose of cocaine, it may only last about 30 minutes in the first place. But what's really important, though, is despite the fact that it is metabolized and eliminated very quickly, metabolites from cocaine may actually stay present in the body for a longer period of time. One major metabolite is benzoyl gonine, and it can be detected in the urine for several days following the last dose. And it's really important, especially if you're taking these types of stimulants, to not mix stimulants with depressants, particularly alcohol. Oftentimes, people are going to mix depressants with stimulants to kind of take the edge off or reduce the extreme arousal that cocaine really produces. But it turns out drugs interact with each other, and alcohol and cocaine in particular interact to basically form a metabolite called cocaethylene. Cocaethylene has, it's biologically similar to cocaine, but it has a much longer half-life. And because of that, the effects of cocaine and anything that has similar activity of cocaine can actually exert a lot of dangerous effects on the heart or other types of organs. And so if you are consuming large amounts of cocaine and alcohol, alcohol may ultimately exacerbate the toxic effects that cocaine has on the organs of the body. Because cocaethylene has that longer half-life, that's more opportunity for those organs to be damaged before it is cleared from the system. So now let's talk a little bit about how cocaine affects the brain and behavior. So in general, our psychomotor stimulants are going to largely affect monoamine reuptake transporters. So it interacts with a variety of different neurotransmitter systems. In particular, it affects dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So basically, it is going to block reuptake of these 3 neurotransmitters. So cocaine's going to bind to those reuptake transporters, and it's ultimately going to inhibit reuptake. So that allows dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine to stay in the synaptic cleft longer, and the actions of those neurotransmitters will be prolonged. So you could say that cocaine is an agonist. It enhances the effect of these 3 monoamines. So here's an example of normal operating procedure versus what cocaine does to it. So here you can see normal operating procedures. We're specifically focusing on dopamine here, but this would just as likely apply to norepinephrine and serotonin. So here you can see we've got our drugs packaged into vesicles, and we've got our reuptake transporters. And you can see the omega figures of vesicles that have bound to the cell membrane through exocytosis, and they're basically sending that dopamine into the synaptic cleft, binding with a receptor, and then the reuptake transporter is taking it back into the cell where it can be repackaged and recycled into the vesicles to be released at another time. Now let's talk about what happens when you take cocaine. So here you can see a molecule of cocaine blocking reuptake. As a result, you have significantly more dopamine in the synapse that is able to make contact with the receptors, thus prolonging the effects of dopamine. And again, this will also prolong the effects of norepinephrine, and it will also prolong the effects of serotonin. Now, what happens when reuptake is prevented? Well, as I've already said, now that you have more neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft, you're increasing the likelihood of synaptic transmission by neurotransmitters making contact with those receptor sites. But we're talking about a very high concentration of these neurotransmitters, as you can see. So these high concentrations will actually inhibit voltage-gated sodium channels. Now, these channels are critical to generate action potentials. So what ends up happening is that by inhibiting voltage-gated sodium channels, that actually blocks nerve conduction. So you may find that when cocaine or chemically similar drugs to cocaine are applied locally to a tissue, it actually acts as a local anesthetic by preventing transmission. So if you go to the dentist and you are numbed, you have probably received something like Procaine, which is better known as Novocaine, or you have received lidocaine. And they were both developed from the structure of cocaine. Now, one thing that I will mention is that cocaine does not affect all monoamine transporters equally. What we're actually finding is that cocaine bonds most strongly to the serotonin reuptake transporter, followed by dopamine and then norepinephrine. So what are some of the different behavioral effects of cocaine? So cocaine is often going to be used and abused for the high and the rush that is produced by the drug. And these are very highly reinforcing. So what we're going to see is that cocaine largely stimulates mood and behavior. So you're going to feel a sense of exhilaration, euphoria, a sense of well-being. You're going to feel really good about yourself. Your alertness is going to be enhanced. Your energy is going to be great. You're not going to feel fatigued, and you might experience a lot of good self-confidence. Now, if you're taking it through an IV injection or smoking, you may experience a rush, which is almost like a sense of pleasure and power, and others describe it as almost feeling like an orgasm might. Now, at lower to moderate doses, cocaine may increase sociability, talkativeness. There are reports of heightened sexual arousal and performance, but research has found that much like alcohol, it's very highly exaggerated. Now, one of the other major things that we know about cocaine is that it can enhance aggressive behavior. Now, what about animal studies? So we know a couple of different things. So those are some of the things that you might feel in terms of your mood, but there are some other behavioral effects. Remember, these are psychomotor stimulants. So what we have found with animals is that in very low doses, you're going to see increased locomotion, so more moving around, more rearing up on hind legs, and more sniffing. But when these are in higher doses, I kind of talked about this a little bit previously, you might see what are called focused stereotypies. So basically, you're going to see a lot of repeated aimless behavior, basically in a small area of the caged floor, maybe a lot of twitching and things like that. If animals are given unlimited access to cocaine, what we find is that they give very heavy self-administration, and sometimes they'll actually be debilitated, and there's also a very high rate of mortality as a result. So the drug is incredibly reinforcing. But you don't see this all the time. Researchers have actually found that when you put cocaine against an alternative reinforcer like sugar under different circumstances, you actually see that preference change. If there are other reinforcers present, you're going to see a lot less of that heavy self-administration. So one of the things that you're going to hear me say about some of these drugs is that these drugs are what are called sympathomimetic drugs. What this means is that it produces symptoms of sympathetic nervous system activation. Sympathomimetic means it literally translates to mimicking the sympathetic nervous system. So it's activating our sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to see a variety of different things. You're going to see things like you would see with the sympathetic nervous system. You're going to go into fight or flight mode. You're going to have increased heart rate, vasoconstriction, which means a narrowing of the blood vessels in the veins, hypertension, high blood pressure, hyperthermia, elevated body temperature. And generally in low doses, this is not dangerous, but in higher doses, this can be toxic or even fatal. Heavy doses and heavy cocaine use can lead to seizures, it can lead to heart failure, it can lead to stroke and intracranial hemorrhage. So these are some of the different negative effects that you'll see. So seizure, heart failure, stroke. Here's an example of a thalamic hemorrhage. You can see here in this portion of this MRI that this white portion right here indicates damage and blood coming into contact with brain cells. So the vasoconstrictive effects of cocaine can interrupt blood flow to the brain, and the more that you use, the greater likelihood that you are going to get things like these. Now, in addition to all of these different effects, the nucleus accumbens plays a role here as well. So in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about dopamine. And what researchers have found is that if you're looking at modeling relapse, so if you inject cocaine into the nucleus accumbens, you're going to see an enhanced motor response. So one of the things that we find is that this has been implicated in drug-seeking studies that ultimately model relapse. And generally, what we will find is that that cocaine-seeking behavior will return if dopamine agonists are injected into the nucleus accumbens. So now let's finish up by talking about cocaine abuse and the effects of chronic use. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, despite the fact that I mentioned how reinforcing this is, one of the things that is interesting is that physical dependence on cocaine is not something that you're normally going to see. So a lot of people are, they start cocaine or they try cocaine because they're curious, they want to try it, they want to be more social, maybe they're self-medicating, they want to have fun, or they just want to get high. So people who often use cocaine may start with legal drugs like alcohol, and then they'll escalate to illegal drugs, and typically they'll tend to start around 13 or 14 years of age. Most people tend to begin by snorting cocaine, the intranasal route, this typically is not going to lead to dependence. Now, you might be kind of curious why the majority of people that try cocaine don't continue their use, or they don't really develop dependence. And there's a few different reasons why. First of all, remember, this is a sympathomimetic drug. It's going to mimic and activate the sympathetic nervous system. As a result, some people may experience a really strong anxiety response, and they're not gonna like that. So as a result, they may not end up using. And there are some other factors as well. So first of all, the drug may not be readily available. There may be some difficulty with financial coverage, particularly if you're using the more expensive routes of administration, such as its salt form. Additionally, there are strong social and legal consequences of illegal drug use, and this is not something like marijuana where people are kind of turning around on that. And there is kind of a fear of addiction or losing control. But you're typically not really going to see a strong dependence. Generally, about 10 to 15% of initial users that snort are going to become cocaine abusers, and 1 in 10 initial users are ultimately going to become abusers. And that's because the stimulation that it gives to you, the euphoria, the confidence that you feel can be very highly reinforcing. And a lot of those people then are potentially going to switch to cheaper forms like crack, freebasing, or IV, and that is going to increase the drug's abusive potential. As a result, some individuals may develop a pattern of what are known as cocaine binges. These are periods of time where people are repeatedly using. It could last hours to days with absolutely no sleep. To kind of give you an example, there's a 3-day binge of freebasing. You may be consuming 150 grams of cocaine. And then what's interesting is that after that binge, some users experience an abstinence syndrome. So there's a crash where the user will feel exhausted and maybe suffer from a depressed mood. They may feel a sense of withdrawal like anhedonia. They don't feel pleasure, a lack of energy, anxiety, and then they'll experience that craving, but then those symptoms will subside. Now, what other factors ultimately affect the transition to abuse? So we know that a couple of other things do this. First of all, cocaine substance use is actually comorbid with other types of psychological disorders like anxiety disorders, depression, personality disorders, stress, and things like that. Additionally, you can have what is called cocaine priming. So you could be exposed to environmental stimuli that are previously associated with cocaine use, which might lead to craving. Now, ultimately, animal studies have found that cocaine craving and that relapse to cocaine increase over time during withdrawal. So basically, the craving increases the longer that you go without it, making you more likely to go and relapse. And that's what's known as this incubation of craving. Now, generally, chronic use is going to lead to tolerance. But what's kind of interesting is that sensitization can also occur. So what we're going to find with sensitization, we may experience increased responsiveness to repeated stimuli. And it's been recommended that there are 2 different phases to this, basically the induction and then the actual expression of this. So induction occurs, this is basically how sensitization is ultimately established, and then expression is the process by which you actually manifest that sensitization. So during the period between induction and expression, you may actually find sensitization increases. Researchers have reported that cocaine's, like the euphoria that people feel, that actually shows tolerance over time. You get less of that euphoric feeling the more that you take the drug. But what they have found is that sensitization depends on a variety of other factors. So that includes things like movement, craving, and locomotor activities. Now, what are the effects of chronic use on the body? Generally, we're going to find regular cocaine use has been associated with a lot of negative effects on the brain. Typically, what we're going to find is that in terms of the brain, people who regularly use cocaine typically are going to have gray matter and white matter abnormalities. They will actually have some decreased volume in different regions of the brain, and that may lead to impairments in verbal memory, attention, and different types of motor functions. We also know that there can be significant damage to the heart, the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract, and the kidneys. So you can experience things like arrhythmia, myopathy, damage to the heart muscle, or even a myocardial infarction, aka a heart attack. Frequent snorting can actually lead to nasal damage. The tissue that actually separates the two sides of the nose can be damaged. And we also know that there are potential attention deficits and cognitive abnormalities in a child. If you are pregnant and taking cocaine, this is what may develop in the child. Additionally, high dose cocaine use can lead to things like panic attacks, psychosis, the sensation of bugs kind of crawling on the skin, etc. Basically, none of these seem very pleasant. So how do we treat it? Well, it's hard to find a really good medication to actually treat it. There are, at least of right now, there are none that are currently licensed for medical use. And that's because of the efficacy of double-blind studies, and there are problems with side effects. But there are some things that are kind of promising. So drugs that compete for dopamine transporters, other neurotransmitter targets like serotonin, etc. Modafinil, which is also used for things like narcolepsy and sleep apnea. It works on dopamine, norepinephrine, glutamate, and GABA systems. Now, disulfiram, which we talked about last week with alcohol, is also very promising. As a reminder, it's sold under the brand name Antabuse, and it's used for alcohol treatments. So remember that Antabuse leads to a buildup of acetaldehyde in the body, and as a result, you get a lot of negative effects from drinking alcohol while you are also taking disulfiram. And a part of the reason that this is beneficial is because there are a high percentage of heavy cocaine users that also produce alcohol. And as we talked about, that produces the metabolite cocaethylene, which is very cocaine-like, but has a longer half-life and thus can be really dangerous. So disulfiram is really beneficial for those cocaine users that are abusing alcohol. And researchers have also found that there's potentially some benefit in those who are not alcohol dependent. Now, in addition to this, there are some psychosocial treatments that can also be helpful. An example of this is what is referred to as relapse prevention therapy, which utilizes very similar kinds of things that you would find in cognitive behavioral therapy. So the idea basically being you're trying to restructure those thoughts. You're also training yourself to avoid certain situations that might prime you to use cocaine again, or engage in different coping mechanisms that are helpful. Additionally, there are 12-step programs that can be used, such as Narconon or Cocaine Anonymous. Now, one of the interesting things that has also been used with cocaine users is what is referred to as a token economy, better known as a contingency management program. So basically, the idea behind this is basically there's this idea that drug taking is an operant response. You take a drug, it produces reinforcing effects. So by reducing the reinforcement, we can basically reduce the drug use. So basically, what you have to do is change alternative reinforcers. So what you might have people do is adopt a drug-free lifestyle. So every day, these users get their urine tested, and every negative urine test of the client is basically reinforced with a voucher. You can't redeem these for money because if they get money, there's a strong chance they're going to buy drugs. So they can be exchanged for retail items that are available. And generally, researchers have found that you're also working to have some community reinforcement, have more positive social relationships, job opportunities, etc. And researchers have actually found that these are going to be more effective than standard behavioral therapies in reducing cocaine use. So generally, it is more effective than behavioral therapy, especially if they're combined with meds like SSRIs. So here we have a group that has been given a placebo, and here you can see in red the people that have been given Cipratalam. Here we have the number of positive drug screens. You can see that if people are taking that SSRI along with contingency management, that's going to be more beneficial than just doing contingency management alone. And this comes from a paper from 2007. But the problem with contingency management programs is that they're expensive to instill and maintain them. And as a result, they take a lot of work. So this is all I had for cocaine. Next time we will talk about amphetamines and then finally move on to nicotine and caffeine.